There are some truths that age like wine in the cellar of memory, growing darker, more potent, until the day you finally uncork them. I have carried this particular vintage for 31 years now, and tonight, as I sit in my study with the Connecticut autumn rain drumming against the windows, I find I can no longer bear its weight alone. The Ashford estate has been demolished for a decade, its grounds converted into a gated community of modest colonials, but I still wake some nights to the memory of that corridor, the west corridor that no one used, that no one spoke of, and that I, in my role as the family's estate manager, had learned to avoid with the same instinctive care one reserves for a sleeping serpent. The Ashford family had employed me since 1987, and in those 7 years preceding the incident, I had developed what I believed to be a comprehensive understanding of their vast Connecticut property. 43 rooms across 3 floors, with servants' quarters, wine cellars, and a library that housed first editions worth more than most people's homes. I knew every squeaking floorboard, every temperamental light switch, every door that required a particular touch to close properly. Yet the west corridor remained a mystery, not because it was locked or forbidden, but because something in its atmosphere discouraged lingering. Even Mrs. Ashford, normally so particular about every corner of her domain, would simply say, "We don't use that wing much anymore," whenever I inquired about maintenance schedules or heating arrangements. The west corridor stretched for perhaps 60 feet, lined with oil paintings of Ashford ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow movement with an intensity that bordered on accusatory. 7 doors branched off from this hallway, 3 on each side and 1 at the very end, all painted the same deep burgundy that characterized the estate's interior woodwork. During my daily rounds, I would venture perhaps 10 feet into the corridor to check the thermostat, but never further. There was something about the quality of air in that space, something that felt heavier, more resistant to movement, as though the corridor existed in a different atmospheric pressure than the rest of the house. Mr. Ashford was a textile magnate who had inherited both his fortune and his peculiarities from 3 generations of successful, but increasingly reclusive men. He conducted business from his study with mechanical precision, spoke in measured sentences, and maintained routines that had apparently remained unchanged for decades. Every morning at exactly 7:15, he would walk the perimeter of the house's interior, every room, every corridor, every alcove, except the west wing. This morning constitutional would take him 38 minutes, and I had timed it often enough to set my own schedule accordingly. Mrs. Ashford, equally methodical, would spend her afternoons in the conservatory, tending to orchids that required temperatures so specific that I maintained a dedicated climate control system solely for that room. Their son, Thomas, had moved to California in 1989 after what the family referred to only as the disagreement, and their daughter, Caroline, visited precisely once each Christmas, staying for exactly 3 days before departing with the relief of someone escaping confinement. The staff consisted of myself, Mrs. Pembridge the housekeeper, and a rotating selection of day workers who never seemed to last more than 6 months. Mrs. Pembridge had worked for the family longer than anyone, 23 years by 1994, and she possessed the particular gift of communicating volumes through meaningful silences. When I first inquired about the West Corridor's history, she had paused in her dusting, looked toward that wing with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, and simply said, "Some rooms hold on to things longer than they should." When I pressed for details, she busied herself with tasks that clearly didn't require such urgent attention, and changed the subject to the upcoming winter preparations. The first indication that something was genuinely amiss came in late September of that year, when the electrical bills arrived. Despite maintaining meticulous records of power consumption throughout the estate, I discovered an inexplicable increase in usage, roughly equivalent to keeping 6 rooms fully illuminated for 12 hours daily. My investigation revealed no malfunctioning appliances, no security systems drawing excessive power, and no changes to the family's routines. The mystery deepened when I realized the increased consumption corresponded precisely with the West Corridor's electrical grid. I began paying closer attention to that wing during my evening rounds. The corridor's overhead fixtures were controlled by a single switch near the main hallway entrance, and I made it my practice to ensure all lights remained off after sunset, partly for economy, mostly for the peculiar sense that illuminating that space after dark might somehow constitute an invitation. Yet on 3 separate occasions in October, I discovered lights blazing throughout the West Corridor despite my certainty that I had left them extinguished. Each time, I would switch them off, check the electrical panel for shorts or surges, and find nothing irregular in the system. On the night of October 31st, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The lights were arranged in a deliberate pattern, alternating in a sequence that spelled something I couldn't yet understand. The pattern was unmistakable once I understood what I was observing. Starting from the corridor's entrance, every third light fixture blazed while the others remained dark, creating a sequence that led directly to the door at the hallway's far end. It resembled nothing so much as runway lights guiding an aircraft to landing, or perhaps breadcrumbs marking a trail through a particularly sophisticated forest. I stood at the corridor's threshold for nearly 10 minutes, notepad in hand, sketching the arrangement and trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Mr. Ashford maintained detailed records of the estate's electrical systems, and I had studied them thoroughly during my first year of employment. The West Corridor's lighting operated on a single circuit. There was no mechanism by which individual fixtures could be controlled independently. Yet here they were, every third light illuminated in perfect sequence, humming with steady current, while their neighbors remained cold and dark. I switched off the main control, plunging the corridor into darkness, and immediately switched it back on. Every light blazed normally. I repeated this process 4 times, each with identical results, complete illumination across all fixtures. Whatever had created the pattern was no longer active, yet I could find no electrical explanation for what I had witnessed. Mrs. Pembridge found me there 20 minutes later, staring at my sketches by flashlight. She examined my drawings without comment, nodded once as though confirming something she had long suspected, and spoke words that chilled me more than the October air seeping through the estate's ancient windows. "It's trying to show you something, Mr. Harrison. The question is whether you're brave enough to look." Mrs. Pembridge's words echoed in my mind throughout the following day as I attempted to maintain my normal routines. The Ashford seemed oblivious to any disturbance. Mr. Ashford completed his morning constitutional as precisely as ever, carefully avoiding the West Corridor, while Mrs. Ashford tended her orchids with the same methodical attention she had shown for 7 years. Yet I caught her glancing toward the West Wing on several occasions, her expression thoughtful in a way that suggested she was weighing some internal decision. That evening I positioned myself in the main hallway at exactly 11:47, armed with a stopwatch, camera, and electrical meter. If the lights were going to illuminate in that deliberate pattern again, I intended to document every aspect of the phenomenon. The estate settled into its nighttime quiet, the familiar symphony of old wood contracting, heating systems cycling, and the distant hum of the wine cellar's climate control. At 11:53, the West Corridor's first light flickered on. Not the harsh, immediate illumination of a thrown switch, but a gradual brightening, as though someone were slowly turning a dimmer control. 6 minutes later, the fourth light began its slow ascent to full brightness. The pattern was identical to the previous night, every third fixture, building a pathway of light that led inexorably toward that final door. This time, I followed it. The air grew noticeably colder as I advanced deeper into the corridor, my footsteps muffled by the Persian runner that stretched its entire length. Each illuminated fixture cast circles of warm, amber light on the burgundy walls, creating pools of visibility separated by stretches of gathering shadow. The oil paintings seemed more pronounced in this selective lighting, faces emerging from and disappearing into darkness as I passed, their eyes tracking my progress with what felt like familial concern. The door at the corridor's end stood slightly ajar, which struck me as impossible. During my 7 years at the estate, I had tested that door monthly as part of my security protocols, and it had never budged, not locked, exactly, but sealed as though the frame had swollen beyond the door's capacity to open. Now, a thin line of light leaked from the gap between door and frame, and I could hear something that made my breath catch in my throat, the soft, rhythmic sound of pages turning. I approached with the careful deliberation of someone defusing a bomb, each step bringing new details into focus. The light seeping from the room beyond was not electric, but had the warm, flickering quality of candlelight. The page-turning continued at regular intervals, leisurely, purposeful, as though someone were reading with great attention to detail. I pushed the door open and stepped into a room that shouldn't have existed. The space beyond the door defied everything I understood about the estate's architecture. According to the original blueprints, which I had studied exhaustively, the west corridor ended in a small storage closet, perhaps 8 feet square, designed for linens or seasonal decorations. Instead, I found myself in a library that stretched at least 30 feet in both directions, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that appeared to predate the house's construction by several decades. A single figure sat at a mahogany reading table in the room's center, illuminated by 3 brass candelabras that cast dancing shadows across countless book spines. The person, I could see only a profile from my position near the door, appeared to be elderly, with silver hair and elegant bearing, wearing clothes that seemed slightly out of temporal alignment with 1994. They turned pages of an oversized ledger with the mechanical precision of someone completing a task they had performed thousands of times before. I cleared my throat softly, and the figure looked up with eyes I recognized from oil paintings throughout the estate, the same pale blue, the same penetrating intelligence, the same expression of mild disappointment that characterized 3 generations of Ashford portraits. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "You're late, Mr. Harrison. I've been waiting for you since 1987. The man, though calling him a man felt inadequate for what I was witnessing, closed the ledger with deliberate care and gestured toward a chair that hadn't been there moments before. His movements possessed the fluid certainty of someone operating within familiar territory, while I remained frozen in the doorway like an intruder caught mid-burglary. The resemblance to the Ashford portraits was undeniable, yet no living member of the family matched this figure's particular combination of features. "Please, sit," he said, and though his tone remained courteous, it carried the weight of expectation. "We have much to discuss, and the window for conversation grows narrow with each passing year." As I moved toward the chair, I noticed that my footsteps produced no sound on what appeared to be a richly patterned carpet that definitely hadn't existed in the storage closet I remembered. He opened the ledger again, revealing pages covered in meticulous handwriting that seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight. "7 years you've managed this estate, Mr. Harrison. 7 years of careful avoidance, of willful blindness to patterns that should have been obvious to a man of your intelligence." His finger traced a column of dates, and I realized with growing unease that they corresponded exactly to every instance I had discovered lights burning in the west corridor. "The question now," he continued, "is whether you're prepared to understand what those lights were truly illuminating." He turned the ledger toward me, and I found myself staring at what appeared to be a comprehensive record of every day I had worked at the estate. Not merely my employment dates, but detailed observations of my routines, my discoveries, my growing awareness of the West Corridor's anomalies. The handwriting was immaculate, old-fashioned, and written in ink that seemed to shift between deep blue and black depending on the angle of candlelight. "October 15th, 1987, he read aloud. "New estate manager begins employment. Shows appropriate caution regarding West Wing. September 3rd, 1990. Discovers electrical anomalies but fails to investigate thoroughly. March 21st, 1992. Questions, Mrs. Pembridge about corridor history but accepts deflection. His finger continued down the page, cataloging 7 years of my professional life with unsettling accuracy. Who are you? I managed to ask, though my voice emerged as little more than a whisper. He smiled, and the expression transformed his face into something both paternal and profoundly sad. I am what happens when an Ashford refuses to let go, Mr. Harrison. When duty becomes obsession, and obsession becomes something darker. He closed the ledger once more, the sound echoing with unusual resonance in the impossible room. My name was Edmund Ashford, and I built this estate in 1863 with money that should never have been earned. Edmund Ashford, for I had no doubt that's who he was, despite the impossibility of the situation, rose from his chair with the measured grace of someone who had all the time in the world to explain the inexplicable. The candlelight seemed to follow his movement, casting his shadow in multiple directions that defied the laws of physics I had always trusted to remain constant. The Ashford fortune was built on a single transaction, he began, his voice growing heavier with each word. In 1861, I made an arrangement that guaranteed prosperity in exchange for eternal vigilance. The lights you've been seeing were never malfunctions, Mr. Harrison. They were invitations, attempts to find someone capable of understanding what this family truly owes. He gestured toward the ledger, which now lay open to a page bearing my name in elegant script. Every estate manager who has served here has eventually found this room. Most flee immediately. Others try to rationalize what they've witnessed. You're the first to listen. The candles began to dim, and I realized our time was ending. What happens now? I asked. Edmund's smile held 30 years of accumulated sorrow. Now you understand why the West Corridor exists, why certain debts transcend generations, and why some silences are more necessary than truth. The room began to fade around us, books dissolving into shadow, walls becoming translucent. The lights will stop now, Mr. Harrison. The debt has been acknowledged. I found myself standing in an empty storage closet, holding nothing but the memory of an impossible conversation and the absolute certainty that some estates carry burdens too heavy for the living to bear alone.